John Rossi, and on behalf of John Mishasik, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon. John is involved in a retreat, Reshaping the World, having to do with UPH and UMC and so forth, and the relationship, and they're having a retreat in Tubac. So with regret, he was not able to be here this afternoon, so he wanted me to say that to you in particular, Dr. Johnson. Introducing Robert Johnson, who is the medical director of Sierra Tucson, the world-renowned center just north of us here. Fine institution. He's a fully boarded psychiatrist. You had your residency in Harbor at UCLA back in '86. Has had a long experience with private practice and also advising and counseling and guiding leadership training with a variety of organizations and industries. I see among the list Sony and community programs and sports programs. I gather you're an athlete. Physical activity and athletics has been a big part, head swim coach, for example. And he has worked with various groups, including a Down group in Orange County. A man of many, many parts, including being certified in addiction medicine, of course, which is part of the reason why he has assumed his present position. Much of your life has been in California, Costa Mesa, and now has moved to Tucson and enjoying our life. Has done some research in depression, the use of certain antidepressants, the relationship of psychosis and physical illness, the role of cholecystokinin in schizophrenia, and very interestingly, immune function in relationship to psychiatric disorders. He's had a number of publications. He's done some work on psychotherapy. And the topic that he will be addressing is the neurobiology of misbehavior and understanding and treating addiction, thrill-seeking, and the interesting phenomenon of dry, drunk behavior. So it gives me great pleasure to bring you Dr. Johnson.
Hey guys, good to meet you. Let me ask, how many people have some experience in assessing or treating addictive disorders? A little bit? Small amount, large amount? Are you mostly residents here? Or? Okay. Somebody's going to say something? Half and half. How many are familiar with Sierra Tucson? Just curious. Okay. I'm always surprised that there really is a internationally renowned program here that a lot of people in the medical community don't know about. So, I mean, just one word. We have a 160-acre campus north of town. Been there for 25 years. We have 5 core programs in chemical dependency, mood and anxiety, chronic pain, trauma, and eating disorders. And we have a really rich, deep level of staff that people fly out from all over the world to treat. So I think that we have residents rotating through there. In fact, I think we have a couple of year-old residents on faculty right now. So, all right. So today's topic is the problem of problem behavior. How many of you have been surprised or at least surprised or chagrined about the myriad creative ways that people in and out of recovery find to shoot their present and future in the foot? I mean, it's just staggering, some of the decisions they make that really impede their long-term goals. So this is really a fascinating, both clinical as well as practical puzzle. Whether you're, excuse me, allergies are bad today with all this smoke and wind. Whether you're developing a program or working with one individual in front of you, it's just imperative that we have a way of understanding and engaging these kinds of misbehaviors in a way that's effective and practical. So I'm going to start with a quick video. Is there a way to turn the lights on? Okay, great. Up here as well? I'll get this one over here. Let me set this up real quick. It's a video that you'll recognize that from a venue that's captured the imagination of a lot of America the last 2 or 3 years. These are some snippets from the Jackass movies. Now, come on, right? I like a good thrill as well as the next guy. In fact, I love to mountain bike, snow ski, scuba dive, even skydive. But raise your hand if it makes sense to you to shinny up a metal pole, drop your drawers, and allow some moof with a sledgehammer dressed in a circus costume to propel a phallus-shaped object at 120 miles an hour toward your anus, right? Does that sound like a party or what? So how does this make sense? So this is one of the things we're going to look at today. What's going on? So if that's not a choice you would have made, what's going on differently in the brain of the guy who just did that, right? Guys, actually a couple of whom we've actually treated for chemical dependency, by the way, right? Let me show you another video that compares that sort of form of entertainment with something a little bit more artistic. It starts with, so Philippe Petit is about ready to take his first step in 1974, 1,350 feet, right, above the grounds of Manhattan, 110 stories high, on a high wire between the two World Trade Center buildings.
I see 2 slabs of concrete, barely inhabited with some construction, no fence, no net, no nothing, and I am frozen to death. I see the other tower and I imagine the void, and if I were to run on this slab, I will just fall to another life. And I had to make a decision of shifting my weight from 1 foot anchored to the building to the foot anchored on the wire. This is probably, I don't know, probably the end of my life to step on that wire. And on the other hand, something that I could not resist, and I didn't make any effort to resist, called me upon that cable. And death is very close.
So which of these do you think that represents? Can I just have a show of hands? How many think that's really artistic risk-taking? It's amazing. I mean, it's we'll come back to him in a little bit. Foolhardy, thrill-seeking, reflective of some underlying psychopathology. You know, if you imagine, let me repeat a quote he said. So he said, "I don't know. This is probably the end of my life stepping on that wire, and yet something I could not resist, and I made no effort to resist it, called me up on that cable. And death is very close." Right? So this guy experienced a craving, right, an impulse to experience a brief high, right, a thrill that he couldn't resist, right, despite potentially disastrous consequences. Think about it. If you can envision standing in that wire, right, over 1,000 feet above the ground, right, what would be going on in your mind? I mean, think about that. I mean, personally, within 30 seconds, I'd be holding on to it with both hands and both legs. I probably developed tetany in my muscles within 30 seconds and drop like a dead fly to the ground, right? I mean, you just would absolutely freeze out. So what's going on differently in his brain and body that not only enables him to do that, but potentially drives him to do that? Yes? There's a different type of risky thrill-seeking and its consequences. Isn't that heartbreaking? So substance abuse, thrill-seeking, rules-bending, rules-breaking, oppositional, blatantly self-destructive behaviors, each one of these putting the participants' long-range goals in jeopardy. How does that make sense? What is this about? Are there common biological and psychological links? And what we're going to do today is talk about what makes that addictive immediate gratification pathway so sticky. So part we're going to do today is we're going to talk about neurobiology of addiction, how the cause and effects of the loss of control over our pleasure pathways that's part and parcel of addiction, how even normal brain development can set up susceptible people for a broad array of addictive behaviors, how those forces continue to express themselves in dry drunk attitudes and behaviors, some of the psychological and emotional traits that predispose individuals to unhealthy risk-taking, and the role of anhedonia and hedonic treadmills in addiction. We're also going to talk about the role of prefrontal cortex in mediating these impulses. And also the effects that drugs and alcohol, as well as mild TBI or even ADHD, have on prefrontal cortex functioning. I'm getting some specific examples from our own experience at Sierra Tucson with PFCs from hell. Given the length of this is actually probably a 2-hour lecture. What I'll probably get down to about here when we're done. If we have a little bit of time, we can maybe I'll kind of give you a couple things in terms of the treatment pathway, but we'll see how far we get. Neurobiology addiction. So fundamentally, the core kind of dynamic in addiction is this. Addiction occurs when the pleasure or reward system in our brain gets hijacked. So getting out of the forest, beyond all the jargon that comes beyond that, this is the dynamic that leads to tolerance, continued use despite increasing adverse consequences, loss of control, anhedonia, withdrawal, rebound. Okay? So this brain system is a collection of structures that attempts to promote certain behaviors by stimulating pleasurable feelings. These pleasurable feelings for all drugs of abuse are ultimately the result of increased dopamine release in the mesolimbic pathway. So substances and behaviors that are not addicting don't influence dopaminergic tone. I love this quote by Madeline Nash. At a purely chemical level, every experience humans find enjoyable, whether listening to music, embracing a lover, or savoring chocolate, amounts to little more than an explosion of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, as exhilarating and ephemeral as a firecracker. Isn't that good? I was speaking at a conference like a week ago in San Diego, and I took about a 3 or 4 hour kind of break one afternoon. The weather was absolutely perfect. Went out and just in sandals and shorts and iPod and sunglasses and rented what do they call those beach bikes that have big fat tires, and beach cruiser. And so I'm riding around, just having a fantastic day. Went up on a bluff and watched the surfers, and also there were dolphins in the ocean. So they were wave riding and then just playing and dancing. And what I found was that literally every time one of those dolphins kind of jumped or played, exactly this happened. A little kind of firecracker dopamine kind of went off in my brain. It felt like such a blessing to recognize that I have a healthy pleasure system where it's capable of experiencing pleasure, right, from natural sources. So the mesolimbic pathway basically goes from the ventral tegmental area it's really helpful to know this pathway. So, and it's actually pretty simple when you boil it down. So it goes from the ventral tegmental area across the medial forebrain bundle to primarily the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, and on to the frontal, to the medial prefrontal cortex. Okay, so from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens to the prefrontal cortex. So even though we're going to predominantly focus on dopamine metabolism today, the truth is that even though dopamine is the final common pathway for the reinforcing properties of drugs of abuse, multiple neurotransmitters are implicated in the acute reinforcing effects of these drugs, including these. So let's take an example or two. Opioid peptides is an example. Increased dopaminergic tone, largely by inhibiting GABA neurons in the ventral tegmental area. Okay, now GABA neurons and neurotransmitters are the predominant inhibitory neurotransmitter system in the CNS. And so fundamentally what opioid peptides do by inhibit the inhibitor, right, which more or less takes the brake off dopamine neurons so that they can fire more frequently and more aggressively. Does that make sense? The role that serotonin has on dopaminergic tone is a little more complex because serotonin has projections that go to the VTA and the nucleus accumbens, but there's multiple serotonin subreceptors, some of which are excitatory, some of which are inhibitory. So that piece is a little more complex. So today, predominantly what we're going to talk about is the role of, is a higher level talking about the role of dopamine, at least initially. So dopamine, some people misconstrue it a little bit in talking about it as the pleasure molecule, but it's really more accurately seen it functions as a motivating signal. This term incentive salience. It sort of more or less sort of tags certain experiences and said this is a high value, important involvement. And so it really triggers motivation. So like an angel or devil on your shoulder, okay, goading you to get up early on a powder day or pull a lever on a slot machine, and evidently stand blindfolded in front of a charging bull. Can you believe that tape? It's sort of the brain's elixir of desire. And there's a lot of experimental research that supports the central role of dopamine in addiction. Rats will self-stimulate the ventral tegmental area or nucleus accumbens basically to the exclusion of everything. Water, food, sex, even if it entails physical pain, until they starve to death, right? So even if the rat has to crawl across a metallic bridge that gives it painful foot shocks, it will do this. In fact, they will do this literally until to the point of death. And if you've ever worked with people with addictions, this is what you see: is there is no stopping that addiction until it costs them literally everything. I think the record for lever pushes from a rat is 10,000 lever pushes per hour. I mean, right? You can see just how biologically, strong that impulse is. And further proof is that if you block these pathways surgically by cutting the pathway from the VTA or administering dopamine agonists, that doesn't happen. So the truth is that there is never enough pleasure to satisfy the brain. When these pleasure systems are stimulated directly, we're never fully satisfied. There's no limit to the craving. It's a barrel without a bottom. It literally never gets full. The more you give it, the more it wants. Excuse me one second. So why are these drugs more addictive than natural rewards that they really are biologically meant to promote? The truth is they release 2 to 10 times the amount of dopamine that natural rewards do. And that release occurs almost immediately. There's no lag time, and it lasts longer. So not only is it more powerful, it's more immediate, and it's longer lasting. So those effects really dwarf those produced by naturally rewarding behaviors like eating, sex, a good volleyball game, a good conversation, a good book. If you look at percent of basal dopamine output, so let's say that normal activities, normal natural physiologic activities that increase dopamine release varies between -200 to +200% of basal release. What do you think this looks like if you add methamphetamine? That's shocking. I mean, how can natural, usually pleasurable activities compete with this? I mean, it completely commandeers, hijacks that system. If we look at more technical data, so this is food, right? 150%, sex, 200% of basal output. Amphetamine, up to 1,100% higher. Cocaine, this is actually conservative. I've seen this up to 1,200% higher. Nicotine actually goes up to 400 to 500% higher. This is really low for morphine as well. It says 200% here. I've seen it up to 450. So let's take cocaine as an example, but really any drug of abuse. Its effect on the reward system is so powerful that it literally overrides all other generally gratifying reinforcers: money, sex, safety, people you love, morality, right? And you see people selling their children for a 15-minute fix. And so drugs of abuse stimulate these reward pathways more effectively than the behaviors they were evolved to reinforce. I mean, isn't that something? What about behavioral or process addictions, like gambling, sexual compulsivity, cutting, purging? We could probably make a list that goes from here to the basement if we wanted to. The truth is that they can be just as powerful as an addiction to heroin or crystal meth and work on exactly the same pathways. In fact, we'll look in a second about some data on gamblers, but they have a sluggish reward system that doesn't react normally to pleasing stimuli, much like drug addicts. Let's look at that a little more closely. fMRI study by Norman Volkow compared brain responses to 12 gambling addicts and 12 non-addicted controls. The non-addicted participants had increased blood flow to the corpus striatum on winning, like normal folks. The addicts had significantly less, right? In other words, their reward system was a lot less active, very much like what you find in cocaine addicts. We'll talk about how that works in a minute. Similar findings in overeaters. Right? In other words, obese subjects had lower levels of the dopamine 2 receptor than those who eat normally. What about ADHD? What you see in ADHD is you see a lot of co-occurring illnesses, including between a 40 and 60% risk, lifetime risk of developing some secondary substance abuse disorder. And obesity is also very high. So there's studies that's showing that the dopaminergic deficits in this reward and reinforcement system in patients with ADHD may well explain these comorbidities. PET scan study, 53 non-medicated adults with ADHD versus a control group, showed that those with ADHD showed a similar reduction in D2 receptors and D2 transporters in this reward and reinforcement system as those with primary addictive diseases. In fact, there's even discussion in the work group looking at DSM-5 development about whether to recategorize ADHD as a disorder of self-regulation. So now we have our brain. This person's brain is completely swamped. Is strongly biologically reinforced for this pattern of compulsive use. What happens next? Develop a tolerance. When you look at measures of brain reward in acute abstinence from all the major drugs of abuse, what it shows is increases in brain reward thresholds. In other words, it takes a greater amount of drug or thrill to produce that same response. I'll give you one example. We had a professional woman in mid-30s, probably 4 or 5 weeks ago. Everybody knows what Ambien is, right? I don't know what the mixture is. So Ambien is a short-acting set of hypnotic, comes in 5 10 milligram tablets. Most of us in this room, if we took a 10 milligram Ambien tablet, we'd be asleep for 6, 7 hours. She was on 12 to 14 Ambien tablets a day, throughout the day, not just at night, and on 45 milligrams of Xanax a day. Okay, so 1 milligram of Xanax is equivalent to 15 to 20 milligrams of diazepam. So how is this possible? What do you think she was complaining of? you're good. Well, first, how is she complaining about anything? Right? How could she walk or talk? Why wasn't she comatose in bed? She's complaining of anxiety. Right? So how is that possible? Well, I'm feeling anxious. I take a pill. I feel less anxious. The pill wears off. I feel anxious again. In fact, I might even feel more anxious now that it's combined with rebound and withdrawal. I go, oh my God, I'm feeling anxious. I must need a higher dose. Right? It just ratchets up. Same thing you see in chronic pain patients. So just as we turn down the volume on a radio that's too loud, what happens with chronic administration is the brain adjusts to these overwhelming surges in dopamine by either producing less dopamine or by downregulating the number of receptors that can receive and transmit signals. Right? As a result, its impact on this reward circuitry can become abnormally low, and so the ability to experience any pleasure is reduced. Have you seen that clinically? We're going to explore that a little bit more in a second. So far, we're locked in this compulsive pattern of use because it's so biologically reinforcing. It's literally, hijacked our pleasure system. We now have developed tolerance. The brain has adjusted and has down-regulated its responsiveness to these drugs. So now we have to keep upping the ante, right, using more and more of the behavior or chemical to achieve the same result. But now, it turns out that virtually every drug of abuse is also neurotoxic. It actually kills brain cells. A study by Paul Thompson at UCLA showed in methamphetamine abusers that there was direct hippocampal damage that in psych testing linked with poor memory performance. At the same time, it caused a 7% increase in volume that reflected inflammation in the brain's white matter. So not only is it directly neurotoxic, but the inflammatory response that it triggers is also neurotoxic. Right? So those things together also contribute to this negative motivational state associated with abstinence. In addition, so there's two ways in which we've damaged the brain now. The third is that the neurochemical systems involved in stress modulation, right, that elevate ACTH, cortisol, norepinephrine, and amygdala-based CRF are also neurotoxic. Does that make sense? So what happens is what we're starting to call a death of willpower. I've got an 18-lane highway in my brain that goes from me to crack cocaine, right? Or any number of other things. And even if this started off as a series of bad choices or as a bad habit, it's no longer just a bad habit, right? That my brain has been damaged to the point where I've lost the ability, even if I'm highly incentivized, right, to transition from this 18-lane highway brain here to this little goat track of recovery, right, practices and mindset over here. So even if my teaching certificate, my medical license, my law practice is dependent on my staying sober, my brain can't help me in that process any longer. This is why willpower alone is insufficient. So let's summarize. So why are these drugs and behaviors so sticky? First, they commandeer or hijack or steal our brain's pleasure systems, reinforcing compulsive patterns of use. They induce tolerance because our brain self-regulates. And they're neurotoxic in three different ways, resulting in loss of control, called death of willpower. Let's also talk about this negative emotional state that keeps pushing us to keep using to avoid that dysphoric state. Everybody knows what the term anhedonia means, right? So we talk about this predominantly in clinical depression or in schizophrenia, the major psychiatric illnesses. So difficulty feeling joy or pleasure, right? So hedonia is the experience, the ability to feel joy and pleasure. If you graph this out, what happens when we use either an addictive behavior or an addictive chemical? Is we use, right? We have increased hedonic tone, right? And then when that wears off, what happens? Right? It carries this tail with it of anhedonia, of dysphoria, right? We feel crummy, really crummy. And then what happens over time? Tolerance kicks in, right? So we get less and less of this good stuff. This gets deeper and wider. So pretty soon we're having to use just to get back to baseline. Right? I mean, how terrible is that? So, and it doesn't. This anhedonic response isn't just confined to substance abuse or process addictions. It can happen even after successfully achieving your vision. Right? You ask a base jumper, how long do your highs last after a base jump? Sometimes you even get depressed on the way home. Terry Bradshaw, who won 4 Super Bowls, I didn't understand how, after every Super Bowl victory, I could find no pleasure in what I had done. I mean, how sad is that? Right? I mean, can you identify? Is there a time when you've reached a goal only to kind of feel this sort of slump afterwards about it? Gee, is that it? Is that all there is? Dr. Hart, pretty good books, Thrilled to Death. Consistent overuse of the brain circuitry causes us to lose our capacity to experience pleasure. When we seek pleasure primarily through extreme, overstimulating thrills, we hijack our brain's pleasure system and rob ourselves of the ability to experience pleasure from simple things. Literally, we're being thrilled to death, to the death of our ability to experience genuine pleasure. As a result, what do? We jump on these hedonic treadmills where we continuously seek out something new and different, short-term mood boosters, to give us a temporary burst of pleasure. So the problem is, in the long run, these hedonic treadmills shut down our pleasure system by forcing us to keep finding things that are even more exciting, more out of the box, right, to give us pleasure and to escape that anhedonic response. I love this quote by Eric Hoffer: "You can never get enough of what you don't really want." Right? Isn't that true? So let's look at this graphically. So, a healthy pleasure pathway is where stimulation has free access to that pleasure center, whereas the barrier is low, right? So normal, natural, healthy levels of stimulation cause pleasure. The addictive process occurs when overstimulation starts to raise that barrier, right? This is a classic process in addiction. We have to keep upping the ante, right? And so we have to keep up the ante to experience any pleasure. Full-blown anhedonia occurs when only the most out-of-the-box extreme levels of stimulation are sufficient to trigger pleasure. Does that make sense? So let's look at an example. You've probably heard that that winning the lottery isn't fully what it cracked up to be. The BBC did a study, actually around the world, looking at lottery winners in their first year post winning. And what happened was, initially, they're caught up in this sort of euphoria, excitement. What you find is it quickly fades, and actually their happiness set point is the same or lower, typically on average, 1 year later. They return to their pre-winning levels of happiness or worse within a year. So how is that possible? What happens is that sudden influx of cash literally hijacks, just like we talked about, that pleasure center like an addiction to cocaine. So simple things can't compete, right? No longer bring them joy. It's completely washed out. I'll give you a couple examples. I have a male cousin who was in cocaine rehab when he won the Illinois State Lottery. I mean, can you imagine something worse? This was like 15 years ago. He won $22 million. Paid out in annual installments. What do you think his life has looked like since then? Completely shattered his life. All he does, he doesn't have one healthy investment. All he does is travel around the country, drinking and drugging with his drinking and drugging buddies, having illicit sex whenever he wants, right? It's killing him. Literally has stolen his life. There was a really interesting article in the New York Times just a week ago talking about the impact on individuals and families who've had payouts of cash from the Roman Catholic Church regarding priestly abuse. Exactly the same thing is happening in those family systems. It's just literally wrecking them. It's tearing families apart. They're getting defrauded. They're buying cars, drugs, alcohol, and literally within 12 to 18 months, most of them are broke. So love this tagline. All too often, the lottery is not about what you win, it's about what you lose. Isn't that good? Question in general, how many of you feel the same level of pleasure in your life now as you did as a child? Right? I mean, so not only is this happening at a macro level, and for people who are abusing drugs and alcohol, and or who are locked into abusive patterns of process or behavioral addictions, but this is ubiquitous. You know, the kind of adrenaline lifestyle we lead. There are so many opportunities for rapid stimulation that we've lost our ability to feel pleasure naturally. This could be a whole lecture unto itself. So part of what comes up is what's the optimal level of and type of stimulation for both ourselves but also our kids' developing brains. A good-looking family. My son and I, 10-year-old son, at Universal Studios in Orlando earlier this spring. I was doing some work in South Florida and flew him in. We met him at Orlando Airport. Spent some fun, 3 or 4 days playing. And what I noticed was, you know, we had a great time, you know, on roller coasters and rides at Disneyland, Orlando, and Universal. But both of us really enjoyed the downtime as well. Walking around, looking at people, looking at plants, animals, right? Just quiet time, even talking and connecting. This summer, we were in California, where I'm from. Took him to the San Diego County Fair. I don't know if any of you guys have been in new rides at the county fair lately, but these are computer-controlled rides that have blaring, you know, punk and hard rock, hard metal music playing. And so these things, you know, can manipulate you so that they're fast and furious. They can stop you hang 3/4 of the way upside down. You'll hang there for 5 seconds, then it'll jerk you around, right? I mean, I was worn out after like 3 or 4 rides. My son not only was not worn out, he couldn't get enough of it. And those little in-between kinds of things that he used to enjoy 6 months ago, he didn't enjoy anymore. He could only go one ride to the next and was insatiable in that desire. So here I am watching in real time, right, this very dynamic, right, play out in my own life, my own family. So we'll talk a little bit about the developing brain and kind of how this, you know, can impact it. So the truth is, since there is never enough pleasure to satisfy the brain, it takes a higher control system, a healthy prefrontal cortex, to control that pleasure system and tell it to quit demanding more and more. How does it work? The PFC, those are prior frontal lobes, helps to coordinate our thoughts and actions in the service of our goals. That's how it helps intention guide behavior. We're going to look at this a little more closely. How does it do that? It does it because it sets goals, it focuses our attention, it makes sound decisions in part by filtering out unhealthy competing impulses. As a result, it keeps our emotions and cravings under control so that we can sustain progress toward long-term goals. So if this gets damaged, we're in trouble. So in order to achieve a goal, you have to have a clear and compelling goal, first of all. So goal setting is really critical in both psychiatric as well as addiction patients. And you also have to have a healthy PFC to serve as a filter between impulses that serve that goal and impulses that would derail that goal. Now, it's particularly relevant that PFCs are particularly important when weak but goal-relevant patterns of brain activity are in competition with stronger, more habitual ones, like impulses toward recovery or sobriety or abstinence versus short-term pleasures like using. So if the PFC is unhealthy, it's hard to sustain a focus on long-range goals instead of immediate gratification. I'm going to show you a slide in a second that shows that different parts of our brain mature at varying rates up to about the age of 25, 28. And what happens is the frontal lobes, right, that mediate, like we talked about, judgment, decisioning, planning, mature later than limbic systems. Yes? So an MRI sequence, so it's showing developing brains between age 5 and age 20. So the blue aspects are more mature parts of the brain. So this maturity kind of comes forward in a back to front wave. And so you can see what starts developing first. right, deeper mesolimbic structures, right, the last thing that develops, right, is regulatory control. How does that play out in the real world? Healthy body, risk-taking brain, right? We develop these powerful yearnings and cravings before we have a regulatory filter to manage them, right? What are the consequences of that sequence of development? In fact, first of all, an fMRI study, 37 people between 7 and 29. What they found in adolescence, the response to rewards in the nucleus accumbens was equivalent to that in adults. In other words, their limbic system was as mature as adults in the response to stimulation. But activity in the adolescent prefrontal cortex was childlike, right? So strong stimulus reward, but minimal judgment or impulse control. What does that do statistically? This changing balance between these earlier maturing limbic systems and later maturing prefrontal cortex spawns increased novelty seeking and risk taking, which actually in the right, in healthy environments is actually a good thing. It's part of what helps us grow and individuate into adults. The problem is when you mix that changing balance with substance abuse, guns, speeding cars, right? What's the result? Look what happens in adolescence. 200 to 300% increase in illness and mortality. The number one cause of death, motor vehicle accidents. Number 2 and 3 cause, suicide and homicide. This is fascinating. What are we doing when we send high schoolers to college? Take this credit card, right? If there's a financial emergency, you can use it, right, and keep you out of trouble. And plus, 13 credit card companies send usually on average 9 invitations to join credit cards. So what happens, right? Everything is stimulus driven. Everything is an emergency. So so they start charging up. We're actually losing more students to credit card default than to academic failure. Is that something? So moving parts get broken. In other words, if we add drugs or alcohol or mild traumatic brain injury to areas of the brain still in development, it causes development to go awry. So it makes it hard to apply the brakes, if you will, to detrimental behaviors. They're in competition with healthy impulses. In fact, let's look at when drug and alcohol use starts, right? It exactly mirrors what we're talking about. It peaks at age, at 12 to 20, 25, 28, right? Just as that brain is developing. So not only are we more risk-taking here, which is why we start, but what does this do? But further inhibits healthy brain development, right? So if this PFC is damaged by injury, drug use, or alcohol exposure, this loss of inhibitory control can cause people who are even highly motivated or incentivized to stay sober to struggle, right, in recovery. So how does it relate to patients who are still doing dumb things even when sober? Anybody run across patients like that? Dry refers to the absence from drinking, whereas drunk, right, typically signifies the persistence of pathological thinking, feeling, or behavior, right, that results from old alcohol use. Dry drunk, right, in the context of what we're talking about, implies a state of mind and associated behaviors that are still being driven by those impaired pleasure systems, right? Leading to lifestyles that recklessly attempt to either regain that juice, right, that pleasure, or to avoid that anhedonia. Yeah? Does that fit with your experience with addicted patients? Let's skip this. And this. So at Sierra Tucson, we've got a lot of experience with dry drunk behavior. No surprise, right? Particularly in patients with really horrible looking frontal lobes. These are SPECT images. I mean, look at this. Give you some examples. This patient borrowed a walkie-talkie from security staff, borrowed a loose term, called a false code blue, right, at midnight, which is always fun to do, right? Look at this prefrontal cortex, the bottom side of the brain. Those holes shouldn't be there, right? There's a hypoperfusion in that prefrontal cortex. This patient called a friend to bring candy, pornography, and drugs to the front gate. The video monitored front gate. Look at this, right? I mean, they have other things probably going on here. They also had a history of mild TBI, but this prefrontal cortex is just, it's from hell. This person borrowed a maintenance cart for a joyride right around our 160-acre campus, right? This actually, if this scan was seen in someone who's 60 years old, you're probably looking at frontotemporal dementia. So let me tell you a case. So we're going to move on to thrill seeking for a second. So Ted Davenport, a base jumper, freestyle skier, living out of Aspen, always wanted to fly, love anything involving big air. Been in the emergency room 30 times for injuries. You guys know lawn chair Larry? Have you heard that story? So Larry, living in LA, tied 45 weather balloons to a Sears Bark Lounger, with a few Miller lights and a pellet gun. So his initial plan was to float up about 50 to 100 feet above the surface, kind of go over the LA basin for a while, periodically shooting out one of his balloons if he wanted to land or if he got too high. Well, of course, he immediately shot up and bounced between 12 and 16,000 feet, right, for 11 hours. The only reason he didn't freeze to death is because he actually wore a flight suit. He's kind of a pilot wannabe. He won this honorable mention for the Darwin Award. Do you guys know what those are? Right. So it's awards given to for improving to people who improve the human genome by accidentally taking themselves out of it. He couldn't win the award because he didn't die, but because he actually at one point kind of flew back into LAX airspace. So it got so pilots started commenting on the guy at 16,000 feet in a lounge chair. So they actually brought him back down. Here's a picture of Larry. Look at this. Isn't that just a crack up? So we all sit somewhere on the spectrum of sensation seeking. This is a term termed by Dr. Zuckerman in the 60s. After he noticed that volunteers who came in for lab tests for a study on sensory deprivation tended to be carrying motorcycle helmets. Right? So there's three major psychological ingredients for risk-taking. One is sensation-seeking, that desire for adventure. The other is people who do this have a relative disregard for harm. They're less concerned about potential damage than most of the rest of us. And impulsivity, right? Acting on your impulses without fully thinking through potential consequences. So Ted, right? Check, check, check. In Russ Poldrak's lab at UCLA, he looks at this risky decision-making primarily in drug abusers, but is finding that a lot of the same pathways are involved in a thirst for adventure are the same. What he has these clients do is study participants is do this BART task, which is really a video game in which participants press this button to inflate this balloon, and as the balloon gets bigger, you win more if you pull out before it explodes. But the balloon randomly pops, right? So basically, it assesses your sort of risk-reward comfortableness, and then you lose everything if it pops. So the idea is to see how big, right, Ted will go before the balloon explodes, or he bails out. So when you do this BART game, it's processing three things: anticipation of the reward itself, and the potential loss of the reward. Yes. So anatomically, what that's looking at is the prefrontal cortex, where we analyze decisions, the ventral striatum, which is part of where we get that dopamine release, and the amygdala, home of fear or strong affect. So for most of us, the loss, that balloon popping, sets off a fear reaction in the amygdala, a painful reaction. So most of us play it a little safe. We're kind of more risk averse than really go for it. What's Ted's response? Right? Let's go. He's in there, he can't stop playing. He's swearing like crazy, but keeps respooling the game. So let's look at his fMRI. This is fascinating. It's exactly the opposite of what you see in most people. So most people's brain will show an activation in the amygdala right here, where the fear resides when that balloon pops, right, or it gets close to popping. Ted's doesn't fire at all, right? At the same time, his ventral striatum is lit up, right? So he has a high reward for risk, but you don't see that in other people. So he has high reward for risk, no fear of consequences. That makes sense? This is hardwired into his brain. He needs a higher level of stimulation to achieve a sense of pleasure, but because he has no fear of consequences, he's also likely to make huge impulsive errors and put himself even at more danger. So is this starting to make sense, right? How this jackass movie clip we showed initially, that kind of behavior starts making sense. How it might tie in biologically with addictive behavior and dry drunk behavior, and the same kind of patient we see, right? Not only in addiction patients, because our core competency is around complexity. It's really unusual for us to get someone who has a single axis 1 or axis 2 disorder. And typically, they have 3 or 4 to 5 axis 1 diagnoses and 2 or 3 on axis 2. So coming back to Ted for a second, he actually has he's developed a fairly adaptive way of managing his brain needs, right? But because psych testing would predict that this guy would be freebasing instead of free skiing. I'd probably be doing heroin if I weren't jumping. In college, it was like, let's get napalmed, yeah? But now I'd much rather be getting up early for a jump. It's like a drug to me. I crave it, right? So he's one of the lucky ones, at least so far. What happens if he gets injured, though, and can't turn to this activity? Jerry Kagan at Harvard. This is a relatively healthy form of self-medication. Guys who are jumping off cliffs or who are workaholics, or is another process addiction, may be just as abnormal as someone who's addicted to cocaine. But as a society, if you're not unhappy, we don't tend to regard you that way. These people have found an activity that gives them a great pleasure, that improves their quality of life, and that keeps them in a good mood and out of trouble. A lot of us are never that lucky. Right? So why are damaged PFCs such a challenge? I don't know if you heard the term, but in recovery, a person is said to still in their disease, right, if they're unable to sustain a healthy recovery mindset, motivation, and set of daily behaviors, whether they're actively using or not. So you can still be in your disease and be that's what a dry drunk is, someone who shows this but who's not actively using. But the question is being in your disease always related to this term willfulness run riot? Is it really a volitional or character, personality, or motivational issue? Or could it be something in their brain that makes it more difficult for them to manage impulses that are contrary to their stated long-term recovery goals? Or some mix of the two? So the question is, what's the answer? How can we reclaim the neurobiological, emotional, and spiritual pathways that have been hijacked by addiction? And is it possible to utilize those same pathways to build authentic, purpose-focused, productive lives? I think this is where I'm going to have to stop, guys. I think if you want the answer, I'll probably have to come back a second time, because the answer is about 45 minutes long as well. It's actually a neat piece. We also come back to Philippe Petit as well. But given our time constraints, I'm probably going to stop it for now. Okay? Thanks so much, guys.